Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, PhD in literature, and someone who realizes that she has not said for a long time what the Foxed Page means. Foxing is simply those little tiny brown dots, little discoloration that you will see on the pages of very old, very beloved books. Today, I am actually coming to you to talk about a very old, very beloved book. That is Orlando by Virginia Woolf. Some of you may have listened recently when I spoke about Liberty, which was a compilation of Virginia Woolf's nonfiction. And at the beginning of that, I did remark at how strange it was that I was diving into the nonfiction and not, in fact, the fiction, when my heart really, really lies with the fiction. And all of what we are covering today is kind of at the beginning of the book. If you're someone who hasn't read Orlando, or if you're listening to this in order to sort of get yourself, ready to dive back in and read it, no spoilers. I'm not going to tell you anything that's going to be like, ruining anything for you. Most of what we're looking at is in the beginning of the book in order to sort of allow you to have the most rich experience when you do read it or reread it. But also for those of you who are just, wanting to like remember how awesome Orlando was, there's plenty of that as well. So once we finished with Liberty, it made sense to dive into one of her novels. And I hadn't looked at Orlando for a long time. I remember absolutely loving it, despite that initial image of Orlando as a 16-year-old, with his machete, like trying to knock down the head of the Moor, the black person, which was hanging. Oh my gosh, I have a total hole in this sweater. That's so funny. Also, for those of you on YouTube who are maybe admiring the hole in my sweater, you also maybe are wondering what's happening with this hat that I'm wearing. It's kind of a spectacular hat, actually. My husband a couple years ago, just went absolutely ham on hats. And this was one he gave to my daughter. I have to say it has not gotten a lot of airtime with my daughter, but here it is with me on my head. And those of you who know Orlando will understand why I am wearing this actually fairly ornate and really beautiful top hat with these greenish and greenish blackish sort of feathers all around the crown of it. And that is because in Orlando, there's a huge amount of emphasis on clothing. Clothing, in fact, is a way that almost every character in the book, at one point or another, is revealing him or herself, and I'm using those gender categories on purpose, him or herself to the world. And Orlando, as a shapeshifter and as someone who lived for 300 years through many, many different eras and lived both as a man and as a woman, wore many hats. So over the course of this, you may see more than just this one. Okay, so why do we read Orlando? Why is it that I am talking about it and suggesting that you, in fact, either go back to it and reread it or really, take a few minutes here or like 90 to see why it is, in fact, that Orlando is such an absolute masterpiece and why when you read it, maybe you really loved it. So I'm really interested in looking at this piece as kind of an extension of a room of one's own. That's a piece of the lecture that we will get to. And again, having read Liberty and having spoken about it, those of you who have listened to Liberty, you'll know that the bulk of that tiny little collection that the Vintage Mini people so graciously pulled together for us, the bulk of that is in fact a room of one's own. And I loved the fact that a room of one's own and Liberty are sort of woven all throughout Orlando, so it seemed like the perfect book to look at after we had looked at that piece of nonfiction. I also really am interested, of course, in some of the questions of gender, and some of the questions of clothing and fashion. Obviously, we're going to be looking closely at the prose. I also want to take a very close look at, line by line, but not for too long, about the sort of levity and the humor in this book. There's a lot of homage to Shakespeare in this novel, and there's also a lot of pathos. So pathos, I think a lot of you are familiar with, which is like, pain and sort of yearning and angst in literature. Bathos is kind of the opposite. I'm saying bathos just because I said pathos. Usually I say bathos. I don't know which one it is. It's a Greek word. And it's essentially low humor. And it's often, well, we'll get to it. We'll get to what bathos is, or bathos. Don't know how you pronounce it. But we're going to take a look at the levity because Orlando is often known, literally on the back of the edition that I have right here, they call it a romp. And it's often referred to as a romp. And it's often known as sort of one of her lightest books. And it is in some ways very light. And that is a little bit of a departure from a lot of Virginia Woolf's work. So I want to take a look at how that levity is functioning because it's absolutely masterful. I also want to dig into the biographical elements here. So Orlando, importantly, is Orlando, a biography. So that subtitle is often left off when you have modern, iterations of the book, but it's very important. Often it will come on the title page. It won't be on the cover of the book. And in some ways, I understand that because Orlando, a biography, you might be confused and well, you certainly, I would think you would be confused if you didn't already know that it was kind of a spoof or like a faux biography. You would in fact think it's nonfiction. It would be confusing, which is exactly, of course, what Woolf intended. But oftentimes, once you pick up the book and it will be, sort of on the title page, a few pages in after all the boilerplate stuff, it will say Orlando, a biography. So we have this playing, this kind of blurring of the line between fiction and nonfiction, which is in fact very much like what she is doing in A Room of One's Own, where that line between fiction and nonfiction is so masterfully blurred. So I'm really excited to dive into some of the meta qualities, some of the sort of the ideas of this kind of faux biography. Okay, I want to give a very quick bio. I said that when I was talking about liberty in the past, and then I actually gave like a pretty fulsome, a pretty serious biography. So if you want to hear that biography, maybe pop back to that talk that I gave on liberty. But what I want to focus on today is what was happening in her life during the writing of Orlando. I think somewhat famously, Orlando really had everything to do with Virginia Woolf's affair with Vita Sackville-West. And we're going to discuss that in a minute. Vita Sackville-West was a very important socialite. She was hugely wealthy and came from a long line of British sort of landed aristocracy. I think that's maybe what you would call it. They weren't royals, but they were like lords, or maybe a lord is a royal. They're like part of the court or something. But so she came down from a long line of these sort of very upper crusty aristocratic people who had lots and lots of land, and in fact had a home called Knoll, which is very much like the home that Orlando lives in. And in fact, many ways, this Orlando is really an homage also to Vita's feeling about her home. There is a lot of interest and a lot of not a ton of the book is devoted to the home, but there is in fact a real emphasis on Vita's love for her home, which you can kind of read as a love for sort of this fallen aristocracy. Vita, was not, in fact, able to inherit her home. It went to some cousin or something because she was a woman. So for someone, Vita Sackville-West famously played with her own gender. She did lots of cross-dressing. She had lots of affairs with women and also with men. So she was someone who was fairly fluid in terms of how she saw herself. And in fact, it was a huge blow to her that she was not, in fact, able to inherit her family home, this beloved castle. I literally think it had 365 rooms. I think that was like one of the things about it. It's like literally like an 8-acre home or something. Oh, if you're watching the YouTube channel, I'll put some pictures of it. I'll put some pictures of Vita, some of Virginia, and some of Knoll, which was the name of her home. That's Knole, in case you're wondering. So, famously, we do know that Vita, it's so funny, in British English, you would say Vita. So I'm very tempted to say Vita because it sounds so much better than Vida, but I'm just going to go with the American because I don't want to feel like overly pretentious about this whole thing. So Vita and Virginia ended up together largely because Vita, who was an established and very like best-selling kind of author, read a bunch of Virginia's work and really was impressed and really, really wanted to know this woman. So So Vita is coming into Virginia Woolf's life at a time when Virginia Woolf was really at the height of her powers. So they would have gotten together, somewhere around 1926 or 27. I actually did look to see like when they very first met, and it didn't pop up right away in my notes or in Google. So I decided to just like not waste a whole bunch of time looking for that. But they got together right around the time that Mrs. Dalloway is coming out in 1925 and To the Lighthouse in 1927. And it's a very, very, productive and also a very sort of successful time for Virginia. And the two of them fall madly in love, and it is not without conflict. Vita is married to a man, Harold, I think his name's Harold, who is gay and has many affairs and, or maybe bisexual, but a lot of this information, I must admit, I am getting from that movie Vita and Virginia, which was not a movie I loved. Honestly, like 99% because of the soundtrack. The soundtrack was so bizarre. It was so distracting to me. But she was married to this gentleman. I mean, I'm like basing a lot of my information, not the dates and not the literature stuff, but like kind of their affair is coming to me from the movie, which I did enjoy watching just from like a biographical standpoint. So Harold, was somewhat jealous, in fact, of Vita's relationship with Virginia because it was very intense. But as Vita and Virginia are carrying on their affair, they're having some like very awkward weekends away with, couples and whatnot. And then Vita goes with her ambassador husband to Tehran and in Persia at the time. And they have this long distance love affair going on, Vita and Virginia do. So a lot of that was informing the writing of Orlando. In fact, I'm going to talk about this later, but I just think this is so interesting. A lot of the communication between these two women, these two lovers, and like really passionate, devotees of each other, were in letters. And it was very difficult for both of them because they felt that they were never in the same instant, which you can imagine if a letter arrives 2 weeks later, to London from Tehran, that you would feel very disconnected in time from your beloved. So I think a lot of the focus on time and on capturing the instant in Orlando, this is my own personal theory. I think it like maybe comes from this idea of the two of them being separated and not being able to sort of be together in the same instant. I think it's a pretty good theory, actually. So we're going to take a look at that in a minute, but it is very important to recognize that they were, long distance at different parts, and it was a very passionate but somewhat tumultuous affair. So at the time when Virginia is writing Orlando, according to the movie, she's kind of at the tail end of her affair with Vita, but becomes very, very interested in this idea of Vita as this kind of, product of all of these generations of this landed aristocracy. At this point, Virginia has been married for 15 years to Leonard, and they have, they're very sort of companionable and somewhat, idiosyncratic marriage, which is really all about companionship and support. And Virginia is very devoted to Leonard and vice versa. So I think he understood some pieces of her affair with Vita. I think he and everyone else, including her sister, were mostly concerned that this kind of passion and all of this energy and all of this longing was going to trigger another breakdown in Virginia Woolf. So I think it was, it was like a very volatile time for everyone, but certainly they made space for Virginia to have this relationship with Vita. So the novel, first and foremost is, in fact, this homage to the life of Vita Sackville-West. But it's also important to note that there was another model for this, which is a woman named Lydia Lapanova. Oh my gosh, I hope I'm saying that right. I hope that's the right name. She's a Russian woman, and she was a dancer, and I think very alluring and very dynamic and interesting to Virginia. So a lot of the novel pulls from her life. I like to think a lot of Sasha, is probably coming from Lydia, but that might be really like too on the nose. Lydia, importantly, was in fact the wife of John Maynard Keynes. I, for my whole life, have said Keynes and Keynesian, but I actually just last night, was at the home of a Columbia economics professor, and we were talking about modernism. I mean, this is not something that happens to me all the time, but we happened to be talking about modernism and Woolf and fiction, and he kept saying Keynes. Apparently, people, it's Keynes and Keynesian economics. So there you have it. So this is crazy to me. Yeah, she publishes Mrs. Dalloway in 1925, publishes To the Lighthouse in May, on I believe May 15th of 1927, starts writing Orlando almost immediately, well, later that summer, I think maybe even like October, sometime that fall, and literally has a draft by March. So she wrote this incredible novel with a huge amount of speed, and I just marvel at that. I mean, she was very good at rewriting, and she did spend a lot of time editing her own work, but there's just no way. Like, the book came out in 1928. It is astonishing to me that what we are reading in this book is like not really that many drafts. Like, I mean, golly, you guys all know that Virginia Woolf is really, like, she's my favorite writer. And when I revisit her work, part of me cannot believe that it was able to be written at all, but certainly not with that kind of speed. Like, it's just unbelievable to me. Again, it was written right after A Room of One's Own. So we really are going to see a lot of the ways that nonfiction, that some of the ideas in that nonfiction, specifically the idea of Judith Shakespeare, the idea that Shakespeare, if he had a sister, that sister would not, in fact, have been able to write, even if she had all of the same gifts that he did. So we're going to take a look at that influence, certainly. But So it's important to see the way that nonfiction is, in fact, weaving its way through this novel. Also, great to know that this was an immediate public and critical success. It just was hugely appealing to everyone. I mean, it's honestly, in some ways, it's such a fun book to read, and it would have been such a kind of a fantasia that I think people really, I know, in fact, that they really ate it up. One quick note on that, which we weren't going to dive into, but I'm going to dive into it here. I'm just going to dip a toe, is this idea that she published this right around the time that another writer published something called The Well of Loneliness, which I have not read. And that was a book about sapphic love, or lesbian love, or gay love. And that book was immediately censored and was, I don't even think, well, it must have been at least published to some degree, because you can still read it today. But Virginia Woolf, because of the fantastic elements of this novel, and by that I mean like the fantasy elements, was able to get a lot of stuff by the censors because, in fact, either things were obscured enough just in terms of like describing sex scenes between Orlando and Sasha, or, there was enough sort of fantastical things happening that people didn't read it exactly as like a lesbian romance. Okay. I'm going to give you a quick agenda for those of you out there who like agendas. First, we're going to talk about the title. Then we're going to talk about those faux biographical elements. We're going to talk about the dedication, and then the opening of the book. Again, the opening of the book, I have to say I picked this novel up several different times and as a young person and couldn't get past that very first image. I was like, ew, I want nothing to do with the 16-year-old Orlando who has, the head of a Black African person hanging from his rafters and, is slicing at it with his machete. That really didn't draw me in. Finally, once I got past that, I realized how incredible the work is. We're going to talk about racism, certainly. We're going to talk about the narrative voice, because it's very interesting here. This biographer, who is often kind of interjecting, is very interesting from a narrative standpoint. We are then going to talk about sex in the book. We're going to then talk about the levity that I mentioned before, this bathos/bathos. And then we're going to talk about time in the novel, and then we will look at the close. Okay, we're going to dive on into the text. So the first thing that we're going to look at is the title. So I say this practically every time I do one of these talks, which is that if you are here to become a better reader, to get a more rich reading experience, all you have to do is pay attention and, maybe dig around a little bit, just take some time and really sort of think about things like the title, for example. So the title here is amazing. Orlando, I mean, it's funny. I don't think until I did this research, I don't think a long time ago when I first read this and fell in love with it, I didn't actually do this research. I just don't even think the computer was a thing then. Certainly Google was not a thing. So it was delightful to look back and to realize how significant it is as a title. So Orlando, I mean, honestly, in my mind, I mostly just thought about Florida and like Disney World, and that's like not a great association, and also just like totally not in the spirit of this novel. But Orlando, it turns out, is a character in one of Shakespeare's plays. Kind of embarrassing for me that I did not know that, but I didn't. Orlando is a person in As You Like It, which was published around 1599 or 1600. And again, I love the echoes of Shakespeare in this book because Woolf was obviously thinking a lot about Elizabethan England at this point because she had just delivered the talks at Cambridge, which eventually became A Room of One's Own. So she's thinking a lot about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's non-existent sister, who would never have been able to do all the things that Shakespeare had done. And so this idea of gender and Elizabethan England would have been very much, sort of top of mind. So she borrows Orlando from this play, As You Like It. And As You Like It, there's lots of gender switching in there. So at that point, Orlando is a male poet. He's kind of the male lead of the play. I'm looking at my notes because this is not, I watched a movie version of As You Like It a long time ago, and it was awesome. I think it was set in like Santa Barbara or something. I wish I could remember. It's a director I love, but I really can't remember who. It was great. Like, I think it was As You Like It. Maybe it was 12th Night. I think it was As You Like It. Anyway, in this, the male lead, he is very devoted to this poet. He's in love with this girl, Rosalind, and at the end is able to marry her. This is like what I have in my notes. Don't hold me to any of that. I'm not a Shakespearean scholar. So it's a comedy, all's well that ends well. And in fact, in Orlando, we also have this kind of comedy. So I'm using comedy in kind of the classical sense, meaning that, comedy versus tragedy. And a comedy is always ending with marriage. This is kind of that marriage plot idea. I said I wasn't going to spoil on anything, and I won't spoil it too much. And I'll tell you when you should turn off the podcast at the end if you don't want to hear about the very end of the book. But I do. I'm going to spoil it a little bit and just say that it's not a tragedy. Okay, we'll leave it at that. There's some tragic elements for sure, but it is not a tragedy. Okay. So Orlando, as a character, comes from As You Like It. And it's important to remember that everyone in 1928, when this book came out, would have been able, not everyone, but most readers, I think, would have made that connection more easily than people did, 100 years later. So it also relies fairly heavily on Twelfth Night. So in Twelfth Night, again, there's a lot of cross-dressing. There's a lot of, people falling in love with other people who there's some question, because if someone's cross-dressing and someone falls in love with them, then there's always this question of gender. It's a very gender-bending kind of play, and it's really, really delightful. And there are lots of sort of overtones of Twelfth Night in Orlando. Before we move on from the title, I want to just talk very briefly about the other Shakespearean elements that can be found in this work. So you have this question of cross-dressing, and it's important to remember, too, that, when these plays were put on at the Globe Theatre at the end of the 16th century and beginning of the 17th, it would have been young men dressed as women. So there would have been a lot of this kind of cross-dressing would have gotten very confusing, because you would have had a man dressed as a woman who is then posing as a man. So there's a lot of sort of layers to this gender stuff that I think she mines really, really well throughout Orlando. We also have a text within the text. So, of course, we have the oak tree, which is the poem that Orlando is writing. And very importantly, that poem, The Oak Tree, is based on a poem that Vita wrote called The Land, which was very much about, her home and the land and her ancestry. So we have that text within a text. We also have a play within a play. Sasha, at one point, is in a play with a Moor. And by Moor, whenever Woolf is using the word Moor, she's talking about people from northern Africa. Othello, very famously is called a Moor. He is a black man from Africa, from the northern part of Africa. So we have this idea of a couple of different texts within the text. You're probably familiar with Shakespeare and sort of the idea of the play within a play. So and how revealing and important and kind of echoey of really important themes and ideas those sort of texts within the text can be. So that's an important element that Woolf is borrowing. We also have a lot of slapstick stuff. I spoke a minute ago about sort of the levity and the idea of sort of the bathos. It's very Shakespearean the way that she does it, and it's really, really excellent. We also, again, have that idea of the comedy, that it ends with a marriage, which is very, that's a very, it's a totally typical Shakespeare comedy sort of ending, which is really delightful. So we're going to move on to the faux biographical elements. So again, on my title page here, it does say Orlando, a biography. So lots of times that's the way that this is addressed. But in Woolf's time, it would have been on the front of the book, and it would have been on the inside as well. We've also lost a couple of other elements, which I think is actually really too bad. In the original, there were several different photographs of the ancestors of Vita, and very famously, there were some pictures of Vita Sackville-West herself. And different biographical sources have these amazing descriptions of when, I think it was Vanessa and Virginia and maybe Duncan Grant got together and took these pictures of Vita while she was in a frame, and she's kind of draped with this pink fabric, and it's very uncomfortable for Vita because they're all loving it, and she's just not feeling great about being sort of scantily clad and, being sort of the object of all of this attention. Although Vita seems like someone who was not shy about attention. But for whatever reason, this did not feel great for her. The photographs are pretty amazing. If you're watching YouTube, I'm going to throw those up here. So throughout the book, you would have had biographical images. You would have had, pictures or photographs of these important ancestors. And these were, in fact, taken from the, portraits on the walls of Knoll, which is Vita's ancestral home. So you had that, and you had the images, and then you also at the end had an index. And they don't do that anymore, at least not in the, in my modern library copy, like my old hardback copy, they do, in fact, include the index, and it's really fun to look at. They don't in most versions that are more contemporary, and I do think we're sort of losing something without that biographical element. But I also think it's important to note that this would have been so kind of shocking back in the day, this idea of a parody of a biography. So at one point in the very end of the book, Orlando makes sort of a joke about biography and this dictionary of British biography or whatever. That is the book, in fact, that Virginia Woolf's father, Mr. Stephen, I can't remember his first name right now, that he spent his whole an older life compiling. So this is this very, very important document to her father and the patriarchy. And at the end of the book, it's really delightful when Orlando's basically like, that doesn't mean anything. That is not important. That's not how we kind of think about biography. That's not the important elements of biography. So you have this very iconoclastic kind of spoof of biography that would have been really kind of earth-shattering back in that day in 1928 in a way that, today the idea of like a mockumentary or the idea of a mock biography and the idea of like a faux index wouldn't actually be that jarring for a lot of people. I mean, people might be sort of taken aback and wondering whether or not it's fiction or nonfiction, but it wouldn't have been quite as startling as it would have been for Woolf's readership. Okay, then we're going to move on to the dedication. It is dedicated, in fact, to Vita Sackville-West, which is not surprising, and their sort of affair was well known enough that I don't think this was a huge deal to anyone. And I think everyone who knew the story of her ancestors and her home and whatnot, they would have seen what was going on anyway. So I don't think this was a huge surprise, but it certainly is bold. I mean, it's definitely bold. It's also interesting. So this book, it's this faux biography, and it is also this novel. And it's also important to recognize that to a large degree, it was like a roman à clé, like a what do you call it? It's like a novel that has people hidden in it, like important people are disguised in it. Oh my gosh, I can't remember the word in English. That sounds so pretentious. Oh, I can only remember the French version, but I really honestly can't remember what it is in English. So you have this book that is all of these different things. It is a novel. It is a faux biography. It's an homage to Vita Sackville-West. It's a pastiche. We have poems and we have this play. We have all these different things. And then it also, of course, is a novel that's like, dressing up a bunch of people who were real and placing them into a fiction. We're going to dive into the text. Chapter 1. He, for there could be no doubt of his sex, though the fashion of the time did something to disguise it, was in the act of slicing at the head of a Moor which swung from the rafters. It was the color of an old football, and more or less the shape of one, save for the sunken cheeks and a strand or two of coarse, dry hair, like the hair on a coconut. Orlando's father, or perhaps his grandfather, had struck it from the shoulders of a vast pagan who had started up under the moon in the barbarian fields of Africa. And now it swung, gently, perpetually, in the breeze which never ceased blowing through the attic rooms of the gigantic house of the Lord who had slain him. So, a couple of things. First of all, I honestly read this paragraph a number of times and was like, ew, no thank you. This is not a book that is interesting to me. I also really do have the habit. If the first paragraph doesn't sit well with me, then I'm going to pass that book right by. So it's deeply offensive what is happening here. So a couple of different things, like minor things. When it said football, in my American naivete, I pictured like a football, like an American football. So part of me was like having a hard time like envisioning this head because it was the shape of an American football, which obviously is a very, very minor point. But when she talks about a football here, she's talking about a soccer ball. She's talking about something round, which is still, I mean, that does not take away from the offensiveness. But it did confuse me a little bit when I very first read this book when I was like, I don't know, 25 or something. So what's important here is, yes, it's very offensive and it's certainly racist. And I am not excusing Virginia Woolf's racism. There are several different points later in the book where she refers to this head hanging from the rafters with the N-word, which is deeply offensive and troubling, certainly in our, in our moment. And I'm not going to do that thing where I'm like, it was different back then, because I'm sure she was racist and anti-Semitic. But what I will say is that there is quite a bit in this book, which if we had more time, we would look at more closely. There's quite a bit of satire. Like, the whole thing can be read, in fact, as a satire. And this time when I was reading it, it really did feel satirical. So satire is basically exaggeration of things in order to kind of correct a societal ill. So if you have this idea of satire in mind, you realize that, in fact, this is very sort of tongue-in-cheek, and in fact, she is criticizing what she is satirizing. So she's certainly, in lots of ways, like, it's an homage to the family of Vita Sackville-West, and certainly an homage, to Vita herself, and it's an homage to the aristocracy, and there's lots of elevation of the aristocratic, classes. But it is also, in fact, critical of them at some points. And we see a little bit of that here. I want to take a look at it. So this idea of, Orlando's father, or perhaps his grandfather. So here we have this idea of the patriarchy. Oh my gosh, we also have the hole in my sweater again. So we have this idea of the patriarchy, which is obviously very, very large, and is like, poor Vita didn't get to inherit the giant castle. So that was a real tragedy for her on behalf of, or because of the patriarchy. But you have this idea right away of the patriarchy and of this the lineage of men. And then you have this idea of a vast pagan. So that idea, there is, I think, a certain amount of satire there. So it's not, this is not, I think we're not meant to be aligning ourselves with this patriarchal colonialist effort. I think we are meant to see some kind of critique of it here. The idea of a vast pagan has that kind of hyperbole. It has that kind of overstatement that you see in satire. Also, certainly the idea of gigantic in the gigantic house, there is, I think, a judgment there. Again, we have a little bit of, it's not even hyperbole, actually, because that house was gigantic. But you have this idea of exaggeration and certainly like underscoring how gigantic this house was. It's also kind of a funny word. And the idea that literally the house is so large that it has its own winds and its own breezes and its own kind of microclimates is also really, in this kind of fantastical vein. vein is, in fact, poking some fun at the people who are living there. And I want to read just the top of the next paragraph briefly, because we're kind of moving further into that idea of satire. Orlando's fathers had ridden in fields of asphodel, and stony fields, and fields watered by strange rivers, and they had struck many heads of many colors off many shoulders, and brought them back to hang in the rafters. So too would Orlando, he vowed. But since he was 16 only, and too young to ride with them in Africa or France, he would steal away from his mother and the peacocks in the garden and go to his attic room, and there lunge and plunge and slice the air with his blade. So a couple of things here. This idea of Orlando's fathers had ridden in the fields of asphodel. So the Elysian fields are in heaven, but the fields of asphodel are in the underworld. So we have this kind of, there's like a little slippage here, because you would think that, in extolling these forebears of Orlando's, that it would be very congratulatory. But in fact, Woolf is placing them in hell. Then, of course, we have this, terrible idea of having struck many heads of many colors off of many shoulders. That is that colonial piece that sometimes I think the book does a very good job of pushing up against, and other times you're just like, oh my God, this is so painful. This was a time, when the British Empire was really waning, and in fact, Woolf and the Bloomsbury Group were really, really critical of colonialism. So I think she kind of comes by this honestly, in the sense that this critique, even if it's very subtle, of colonialism is something that sort of aligns with her socialist tendencies and with her ideas of, sovereignty for everyone else, and the idea of not, in fact, policing the world, and not, in fact, owning different parts of the globe. So there are also some funny little things in here, like when he says he's too young to ride with them in Africa or France. That is so funny to me, because it's like, I hope you can just see like the humor of it when I just read it, or when I read it the first time. But like, not being able to ride with them in Africa is like this grand statement of his youth and his determination. But then and also France, because it's right there, but it's like he's not even old enough to do that. And so in fact, he's going to be up in the rafters. There's also this idea here of like all of this plunder and all of these, heads off of shoulders that all of these patriarchs are gathering, and they're totally useless. They're going to be hanging from the rafters for a young boy to essentially play with. So I do think that there is a subtle but somewhat significant critique of colonialism here in the beginning, which I only point out not to excuse the racism, but to say that there is, in fact, this anti-colonial bent that we see throughout the book. We are going to move on to talk about this incredibly deft and really, really effective biographical sort of narrator that we have here. So right on page 3, we see the beginnings of what is this biography, but already from the very start, it's pretty unconventional. So usually, if you were starting the biography, like the life of Pope or something, you would begin with he was born at such and such a time to such and such parents and such a place. But Woolf instead is dropping us right into a scene where Orlando is 16 years old and is, doing this thing. And immediately we dive into this question of racism / colonialism. So you have a lot of action right from the start. And in fact, that is very kind of not biographical. So it's a little bit later that, on the same page, literally on page 3, we are getting this idea of the narrator's voice. But it's subtle in the beginning because, in fact, it feels like the omniscient narrator that you would have almost in a realist novel or even a modernist one where it's fairly close to Orlando's perspective. So it's on the next page that we really have the biographer make himself known. So the biographer says the thing here. Happy the mother who bears, happier still the biographer who records the life of such a one. Never need she vex herself, nor he invoke the help of novelist or poet. From deed to deed, from glory to glory, from office to office he must go, his scribe following after, till they reach whatever seat it might be that is the height of their desire. I love this so much. So it's a lot of work is happening here. The mother is mentioned a few times throughout the book, especially at the beginning when Orlando's kind of separating himself. The mom is like very closely aligned with peacocks, which I think is funny. I mean, again, that kind of aristocratic motif there, and the mother as sort of not really being particularly involved. But in this case, she's very proud of Orlando. And the idea, though, of the biographer and the mother as being somewhat aligned, I love, because both of them are essentially creating a life. I mean, we're giving a lot more credit to the woman who actually birthed Orlando than the biographer. But Virginia Woolf is, in fact, in many ways, she is the creator of this character, and she is, in fact, birthing this Orlando. So, but right from the beginning, we have this idea of the mother and then a male biographer. The gender is very clear from the start. Never need she vex herself, nor he invoke the help of novelist or poet. So he is doubling down here on the idea that this is not a novel, this is not poetry, and in fact, it is told from this like very male, authoritative sort of biographer standpoint. So it's really interesting that right on the second page of the book here, we're having like this very sort of forceful entry of the biographer himself into the text. Later, at some point, he also talks about the reader and his responsibility or his delight or something. So the reader is also a male, which is really important because obviously, Virginia Woolf is not a male biographer, but she's inhabiting this role, I think, in many ways to make fun of the ideas of biography. And in fact, we see that right at this introduction, this idea of from deed to deed, from glory to glory, from office to office he must go, his scribe following after, till they reach whatever seat it may be that is the height of their desire. So I like how much, the scribe here is the biographer who's sort of following along. This also, I kept thinking about this, quick aside, about the Aristotelian, the rule of three. So Aristotle, a long time ago, when he was talking about aesthetics, said that you always want three of something or an odd number of something, not two of something. And throughout the whole entire book, there's lots and lots of listing of things. And when it is like a somewhat truncated list, there are always three things that she gives, and it's very satisfying. There's something that the human sort of brain wants to have in threes like that. So the idea of deed to deed, glory to glory, office to office, we have those three things that are repeated, and the idea of the kind of lowly scribe, like jogging after, keeping up with him, and then like arriving at whatever seat they desire, is this very kind of overblown way to talk about it. It's really just like, it's so well done, and it's also, again, doubling down on kind of the male authority here, and that this is factual. It is not, has nothing to do with novelistic prose stuff, which is so beautiful because, of course, it's a novel. And then when we go down a little bit further, we have this description. The narrator, biographer, is talking about Orlando's youthful beauty. For directly we glance at Orlando standing by the window, we must admit that he had eyes like drenched violets, so large that the waters seemed to have brimmed in them and widened them. And then that goes on, but I want to just note there briefly that we move very quickly from this idea of this male biographer to this plural, this first-person plural, this we. So, if you think about grammar, I is the singular first person, I, and we is the plural first person. So it's the idea of you and I together. And I love this. The fact that we is used throughout the book instead of I as the biographer is so cool because it totally implicates the reader. The reader is drawn in, and the reader has to really participate in this whole sort of biography making, which is just so masterful. It also operates a little bit like a Greek chorus, which is very cool. This idea of getting a lot of information from this group of people who are in the know, but who are sort of, sidelined, who are not, in fact, part of the action. And it also is a little bit, I imagine, like the court. Like there's kind of like a rumory kind of thing happening, like a little gossipy thing that is happening, that in fact the reader is somewhat implicated in. It's so good. So one of the other elements that this like faux biography allows, which I think is so genius, is that there can be some kind of philosophizing. So again, those of us who have just revisited A Room of One's Own will be kind of hip to this this real importance that Virginia Woolf places on these sort of philosophical ideas. And of course, you know, that would have been a very big deal for her father, who was in fact a philosopher, and you know, a lot of the men that she revered, you know, were in fact like the ancient Greeks. You know, I mean, she's like back with the OG philosophers, and then also, of course, those of the 19th and, you know, very early 20th century. So we have on page 35 of my version, it's the beginning of chapter 2. So we're just winding up the first chapter. And then we have this, this sort of important philosophical aside on the part of the biographer. And there's lots of this, but this is just a very good example. The biographer is now faced with a difficulty, which it is better perhaps to confess than to gloss over. Up to this point in telling the story of Orlando's life, documents, both private and historical, have made it possible to fulfill the first duty of a biographer, which is to plod, without looking to right or left, in the indelible footprints of truth. So this is so cool. Like, this idea of truth, of course, is, you know, one that is very important in A Room of One's Own. And what she does in that essay is posit that, in fact, truth is better found in fiction than it is in sort of facts. So it's a really cool idea of like, you know, history with a capital H and sort of all these facts that, I mean, some facts are in fact factual, but a lot of facts, you know, in capital H history are, you know, things that are assumed or things that are curated in ways that tell a story in a very different way than like the truth of whatever that thing is. So we have this idea of Woolf playing with the idea of truth here, because she's saying, you know, the biographer has to plod and not look left or right, but has to stay in the tracks of truth. And obviously she is going to be working against that throughout the novel and already has done. But this idea of like, okay, up until now, I've had all these documents that I've been able to look at, or we have, you know, the biographer and the reader together. And now the biographer's going a little off-piste. So you're sort of, you're reminded of the fact that this is meant to be a biography and that we are meant to be hearing the truth and like capital H history. But you also have this idea of like, okay, now I'm going to have to like, you know, it's not going to be novelistic, but we're going to have to, you know, surmise, and we're going to have to, you know, be a little bit more open-minded about what this truth is. I will say, too, that truth and beauty are words that come up together throughout the whole novel. And again, that was so satisfying because a lot of A Room of One's Own is this real sort of preoccupation with the idea of truth and beauty. Really as like the writer's first, you know, in many ways, the writers, fiction writers and biographers, their first duty is to deliver truth and beauty, which is just, it's so, so important. I also really love the fact that this faux biographer does allow for some levity. So on page 42, so this is when I loved this part. Speaking of the ancient Greeks, I mean, you know, Virginia Woolf famously did not go to college. She could not go to Cambridge, although she delivered those important lectures there. But she read very, very widely and very sort of freely through her father's library, and in fact read a lot of, and she had some Greek tutoring, so she was able to read like a lot of these philosophers, I don't know, like practically in the original. So this is the kind of levity that this biographer can lend to the story. Orlando is looking for a piece of paper in his desk in order to start writing The Oak Tree. The biographer is now describing the desk. Within were some 50 drawers of cedar wood, and upon each was a paper neatly written in Orlando's hand. He paused as if hesitating which to open. One was inscribed The Death of Ajax, another The Birth of Pyramus, another Iphigenia in Aulis. This is really testing me here, people. Another Death of Hippolytus, another Meleager, another The Return of Odysseus. In fact, there was scarcely a single drawer that lacked some name of some mythological personage at a crisis in his career. So that is so funny to me because you have this kind of, I mean, as a reader in the 21st century, like I didn't know who a lot of these people were, although I really got the whole thing about Odysseus returning, because that was a real crisis point for him. So at least one of those, I hope, is somewhat familiar with the reader. But then she goes on to sort of name this thing, which is very funny, which is that, every single one, like it's like Orlando's a little bit of a poser here and is totally like, meticulous about all of these different things that he has written about all of these important Greek people. But the fact that they are all in a crisis in their career, and that is obviously what Orlando himself is also facing. So the idea of a crisis in career is so contemporary and so kind of now and modern that in juxtaposition with all of these important Greek tales, you really get this sense of kind of deflation, which is what this bathos is all about. You have sort of this high-flown idea or diction that is then suddenly deflated, which we're going to get into more of that soon. But I really liked the fact that the biographer, because there is a certain amount of omniscience here, can really play into some of this stuff. So Woolf very famously is, she's like the like most, in my opinion, one of, if not the most important modernist writer. So, and modernism came after realism, and it was a very important literary movement because it really worked against what had come before it. It was all about making something new in the face of industrialization around the turn of the century, and then the First World War. There were so many horrible, absurd, terrible things happening that the old models of realism just did not work anymore to describe like the horror that people were facing. So you have modernism come in, you have lots of fragmentation, you have inner monologue, you have stream of consciousness, you have a lot of figurative language. So this book is in fact very modernist in many ways. You can see lots and lots of this style of writing throughout. But there are also elements here that are very postmodern. So postmodern fiction, you really think about sort of the 60s and 70s in the United States mostly, and it's a bunch of like hyper-intellectual dudes for the most part, and they really started playing with form. So again, you can think of David Foster Wallace, who has all those footnotes, and you think of Thomas Pynchon, lots of like, fixation on consumerism and absurdity. So it's sort of bringing modernism even further. And in all of the postmodern stuff, there's this real emphasis on like meta stuff. And meta simply means that whatever the text is talking about itself. So anytime, you get to the end of a book and it turns out that like the first person narrator has been writing that book the whole entire time, and like the thing that they finish writing is what you're holding in your hands, that is an example of sort of this meta literary stuff. But Woolf, like way before any of the postmodernists, really has a lot of elements of postmodernism, and they almost all hinge on the idea of this biographer and this narrative voice. So you have a lot of this kind of meta stuff where lots of times in parentheses or in brackets, you will have the biographer kind of step outside the text and say something about the text itself, which is so cool. I always love it. At one point, there's like these admissions like, we may be wrong, that kind of thing. So it's really also like pointing to the tenuousness of the idea of biography, but it's really excellent. There also is, again, time is a real preoccupation throughout the entire novel. And I loved the times when the biographer would put the date either in parentheses or just in the text. And so we are moving toward the date of publication. And in fact, the very end of the book is the date that it was published. So you have us moving toward this date of publication, but you have the biographer who is very, subtly, but also like very firmly giving us a time and sometimes the space in which he is writing his work. So we're moving forward in time, and it's sort of 1927 to 28 exactly when Virginia herself was writing this thing. So you have that kind of like meta element where we in fact are talking about the dates during which both Virginia Woolf and this faux biographer are writing the text. We also have, again, these intrusions on the part of the, like we just had, like, the biographer up until now has had documents and now we don't have documents. So those kinds of intrusions where you are made aware of the fact that this is a text. It's not like the realist novel where you're supposed to just kind of dissolve into like Madame Bovary and just be like part of that world. In fact, you are reminded again and again throughout Orlando that there is a biographer writing, which should, in fact, make you think a little bit about the fact that there is also a Virginia Woolf writing. Okay, so I love that. I love all of these postmodern elements that you see in this book in ways that you don't necessarily see in a lot of the other fiction. Okay, we're going to talk about the prose and just like how incredible this prose is. And the way that we're going to do that today is by looking at this very specific idea, which is this failure of language. Throughout the entire novel, there are lots and lots of different times when our narrator talks about the failure of language. And it's very important because a lot of what Woolf is doing with her fiction is this idea of testing the limits of language. So I want to look carefully at the prose, at the passages in my edition that are pages 22, 23, and 24. And this is going to be like a little bit quote heavy, but I really think it bears, this kind of close reading. And it's also just so delightful to dive a little bit deeper into this gorgeous prose. So on page 22, I should not be wearing this hat. I should be wearing a different hat. This section of the novel is about Sasha and has everything to do with their passion, which is why we have this sort of Russian situation happening on my head. And I want to talk briefly now, just because this is a good time to do it, about these fantastical elements in the book. I listened to one interview and these guys were talking about how there's a lot of magic realism here in this book. And I disagree. I don't think in some ways that it rises quite to the idea of magic realism. There isn't so much of sort of the plot depending on some of these things. And it's also a little bit less exaggerated than, for example, Garcia Marquez. So, but there are a lot of fantastical elements, and it's really important in part because this idea of this truth, some of the hyperbole and some of the exaggeration and some of this kind of like impossible things that happen are in fact trying to sort of push against that idea of biographies as being true. I also think oftentimes this kind of hyperbolic thing or like this fantasy thing is a really effective way that our narrator is criticizing the aristocracy. So there's at one point there is a description of Orlando being by the fire and an entire oak tree being in the fire and being burnt down to the ashes because that's how big the fireplace was. Or these sorts of ideas that are exaggerated and kind of overblown often are being used as a sort of critique, which is really an excellent way to sort of handle these fantastical elements. Of course, a lot of them are so important too, because when we have the idea of Orlando going to bed one night as a man and waking up the next day as a woman and sort of not batting an eyelash and not really like caring and not being very fazed by it, except for the fact that then he realizes all of the limits she realizes all of the limits that come with womanhood, which is really obviously a very important critique. But we also, there's a lot of really important stuff that's happening with these larger fantastical elements because, the sort of underlying idea there is that whether you're a man or a woman, you are the same person. It's a very important concept, and it's one that is brought throughout the book. Henrietta, that actually would have been cuter. Harriet is a good example. Harriet, who's actually Harry. There are lots of these examples. And Orlando, later as a woman, she dresses as a man. There's all sorts of this idea of being the same person and yet being able to occupy both male and female sort of selves, which is so important. And this kind of fantastical transformation is really a very important way to underscore really that the differences between men and women are, except for the ones that society puts on women. Other than that, they're essentially the same person. The idea of time, too, is obviously the other very large fantastical element. And that's very important, in part to show, I think one of the things she's doing with time is looking at how, lots of things have changed since Elizabethan England, but a lot of things have not changed. So this idea of having the same person live almost 400 years gives you this sense of what has changed and what has not. It also really gave her a good way to be very critical of the 19th century. Wow. Like when that darkness descends on England, it doesn't let up for 100 years. Really, really strong critique of Victorian England, which, warranted, was not a great time for women, that's for sure. But you also, of course, have this fixation with mortality. So the idea of time, whenever you're reading anything, if there's a lot of preoccupation about time, you should be thinking about death. And certainly at the end of the book, when the clocks are chiming and it is so unsettling and like just downright like destructive for Orlando, you really need to be thinking about mortality. Okay. So this is when the Thames has frozen over. We're gonna dive into this part here with Sasha and Orlando and their love for each other. Hot with skating and with love, they would throw themselves down in some solitary reach, where the yellow osiers fringed the bank, and wrapped in a great fur cloak, Orlando would take her in his arms, and know, for the first time, he murmured, the delights of love. One of the reasons why I think the prose, or another reason why I think the prose is so excellent, is because Woolf selects these details that are just incredible, or sort of paints these images that are incredible. So I want to take a look quickly at a couple of these different images that are just unbelievable. So one of the things, this kind of like writerly kind of idea, is that if you are a writer out there, take note, that when you're trying to describe something for the reader, you want to make sure that you are providing details that the reader would not be able to provide herself. So, for example, if you're going to describe a barn, the reader is going to have a picture of the barn. You don't need to talk about, the largeness of it, or my personal barn is red, with white, trim and stuff. But you don't need to do the things that the reader might already know. What you need to do is talk about how, the upper window is cracked and broken. So you have to provide a detail that the reader will not already have supplied for themselves. So here we have a further description of Sasha, and we've added in this really, I think, very memorable detail. But there was something in her tone. It might be the fault of the Russian consonants. Again, here we have this idea of language. That reminded Orlando of a scene some nights since when he had come upon her in the secret gnawing a candle end in the corner, which she had picked from the floor. True, it was pink, it was gilt, and it was from the king's table, but it was tallow. So we have this idea of this Russian woman who he is so passionately in love with. She's chewing on this tallow candle in the corner. It's so memorable and so specific that we have this sense of all the different ways that he's kind of like repelled by her. And instead of, describing a scene, or instead of, well, she does in fact describe a scene, but instead of like having them get into a fight or describing the ways that she repelled him, we just have this one very specific incident that sort of encapsulates all of the ways that he would have in fact been grossed out by Sasha, all of her sort of weaknesses. And again, we have this parenthetical about the consonants, about the Russian language, and language being so important in terms of understanding one another. And then on the very next page, we have, in fact, this flip happens. And this is, very indicative, I think, of the passionate affair that the two of them were having. Suddenly, everything changes because, in fact, Sasha is complimenting our Orlando and sort of raising him up again. And then she praised him for his love of beasts, for his gallantry, for his legs. See, there's three things. That's a little Aristotelian rule of three there. Ravished with her praises and shamed to think how he had maligned her by fancying her on the knees of a common sailor and grown fat and lethargic at 40, he told her that he could find no words to praise her. Again, we have this kind of inability of language to do what we need it to do. Yet instantly bethought him how she was like the spring and green grass and rushing waters. And seizing her more tightly than ever, he swung her with him half across the river so that the gulls and the cormorants swung too. So here we have this idea, the idea of Sasha as being this green flowing river is so beautiful. It's such an incredible way to talk about what she means to him. I think it's such an apt metaphor. And then also birds, wild birds are a very big deal throughout this whole entire book. At the end, we have, a goose that is very important. And I think we are meant to believe that the whole thing has been kind of this wild goose chase. But here we have cormorants and what's the other bird? Gulls. And a cormorant, I don't know if you've ever seen one, but those are really like dark, kind of like malevolent looking birds. So I think what we are meant to do here is see the gull is sort of an Orlando type, and then we have Sasha, who is more of the cormorant. I mean, I'm just like reading a little bit into that, but I think we are, that could be one, I think, decent interpretation. But then we have this. And halting at length, out of breath, she said, panting slightly, that he was like a million-candled Christmas tree. So this is such a beautiful thing. He's talking about her as this green river that's flowing. And then she's like, oh, you're a million-candled Christmas tree. And the beautiful thing here is that she has been gnawing on this tallow candle, which is really grossing him out. And then she is sort of turning all of that upside down with flattery and saying that he's like a million-candled Christmas tree. And that motif of these candles comes up again and again throughout the book. And in fact, at the very, very end, 400 years from when this is happening, someone lights a pink candle and Orlando thinks of a Russian girl. So at the end, you have all of these beautiful things coming full circle. And largely, you remember at the end that the pink candle was this tallow that she, in fact, was chewing on that she got off the floor. So some of these details are not only so telling, but they also allow for these motifs that continue throughout. Every time you see the candle, you're meant, I think, to remember flattery and the limitations of language and the importance of metaphor and all of these different things that she has sunk into this one section right here. We're going to look at two more items. One is the idea of sex in the book. We're not going to dive too deeply into this, but I want to look at sex as a metaphor for creation and this idea of writing and sex. And then we're going to look at the levity and then finally the end. So on page 42 of my edition, we have this very sexualized, really sort of intense description of Orlando writing, which is very, very, I think, deftly done and also very suggestive. So on page 42, importantly, this is when Orlando wants to write and his mother makes him understand that, in fact, for a noble person, publishing and writing is literally like the worst, most embarrassing thing you could do. So he's definitely, not going to be doing that. And then he finds himself in the middle of the night, unable to, resist the urge. Now, however, that it was the dead of night and he was alone, he chose from his repository one thick document called Xenophilia, a Tragedy, or some such title, and one thin one simply called The Oak Tree. And then he approached the inkhorn, fingered the quill, and made other such passes as those addicted to this vice begin their rites with, but he paused. As this pause was of extreme significance in his history, more so indeed than many acts which bring men to their knees and make rivers run with blood, it behooves us to ask why he paused. So when we have this pause, there's just about a page worth where he is essentially talking about nature and the idea of language capturing nature and how difficult it is to capture things with words, which is, of course, a preoccupation through the entire novel itself. And then right across, about one page later, we have this. As if to vent his agony somewhere, he plunged his quill so deep into the inkhorn that the ink spurted over the table. So we have the act of writing, which is highly sexualized. I mean, we've got this thrusting of the quill and the spurting of the ink. It's this idea of sexual relations as, in fact, being very, inspiring and really being productive and sort of allowing whoever whoever's undertaking the writing, to create something and to create an intimacy, which here Virginia Woolf, I think very purposefully, is equating with the idea of intercourse. We're going to look at the levity, at the bathos in the novel, and then we're going to finish with the close. So on pages 7 and 8, very early in the novel, we have the first of this. With no more than 6 inches of looking glass and a pair of old candles to help him. So in this first example, we have a young Orlando at his home, which is, this ancestral home of Vita Sackville-West, Noel. He is at his home because the queen is about to come and visit, and so he suddenly has to rush to prepare. With no more than 6 inches of looking glass and a pair of old candles to help him, he had thrust on crimson breeches, lace collar, waistcoat of taffeta, and shoes with rosettes on them as big as double dahlias, in less than 10 minutes by the stable clock. He was ready. He was flushed. He was excited. But he was terribly late. So I love this. Again, this is this idea of bathos, where we have this kind of high-flown language. We also have a hole in my sweater. We have this high-flown language that is like building and building into sort of like this like very ornate and sort of overblown kind of fiction, and then it is punctured by something very real here, which is this idea. But he was terribly late. So I love this example, and we're going to take another look. This is page 5. One look out of the window at bees among flowers, at a yawning dog, at the sun setting, once thinking, how many more suns shall I see set, etc., etc. The thought is too well known to be worth writing out. And one drops the pen, takes one's cloak, strides out of the room, and catches one foot on a painted chest as one does so, for Orlando was a trifle clumsy. So we have this big moment. It's this big philosophical thing. He's thinking about mortality. We have bees and flowers. We have a somewhat sexualized vision. We have all this idea of how many suns will I see set? I need to get out in the world and experience these things. And then he trips over, a chest nearby. So here we have this idea of this really overblown, poetic, lyric, philosophical language that's sort of raising us up, and we're expecting, some sort of like big finish. And then in fact, we have some sort of slapstick thing where he is tripping over a painted chest. Then we're going to look on page 41. Every one of these things that I'm reading is, it's just also a really good excuse to kind of dig into some of this language. So we're still relatively early in the book of our, 200 pages. We're about 40 pages in here. But he has sort of been infected by this desire for fame. So he says, he would give every penny he has, such is the malignity of the germ, to write one little book and become famous. Yet all the gold in Peru will not buy him the treasure of a well-turned line. So he falls into consumption and sickness, blows his brains out, turns his face to the wall. It matters not in what attitude they find him. He has passed through the gates of death and known the flames of hell. Happily, Orlando was of a strong constitution. So I love this one because it is so dire. I have to say, too, anytime Virginia Woolf makes any kind of allusion to suicide, which happens occasionally in her work, it's really difficult to read because, of course, famously, she died by suicide in 1941. So, but this idea here, you have this kind of heightening and growing and sort of increasing thing about he needs fame, he'll do anything for fame. He's in this hell because he's not able to write well. And then happily, Orlando was of a strong constitution. The jump from hell to happily, and the beginning consonant being the same, is so incredible. So we have all this angst, and then it's punctured. It's sort of deflated with this idea of happily, and then going on from there. It's so masterful. Also, of course, this is, a very important theme for Virginia Woolf, which is this idea of fame and this idea of immortality through language. Vita Sackville-West's work sold, in fact, much better than hers did, and she was very jealous of that. Even here, when she was at the height of her powers, she always had a little bit, maybe a less readership. I like to think, smarter, maybe like a more discerning readership, in fact, than Vita Sackville-West, whose work we are not still, in fact, reading. Okay, and then we're going to look at one last example of this kind of bathos. on page 47. So this is when he has met Nick Green, which very coolly was a character that pops up in A Room of One's Own. So you have him, sort of presaged during those talks that she gave at Cambridge, and then now he is appearing in Orlando. By the way, in Liberty, I said that he was a character in The Waves, but that was incorrect. He was, in fact, a character in Orlando. He is. So here we have Orlando meeting with Nick Green. Poet though he was, it seemed as if he were more used to scold than to flatter, to quarrel than to coo, to scramble than to ride, to struggle than to rest, to hate than to love. This too was shown by the quickness of his movements, and by something fiery and suspicious in his glance. Orlando was somewhat taken aback, but they went to dinner. So again, you have these kinds of philosophical ideas, and then it's brought down to earth with this idea, but they went to dinner. And there's something specific too. It wasn't like, but they broke bread or they shared a meal. It was that they went to dinner. It's again, that kind of really delicious deflation that we have after this kind of high-blown, sort of monologue that we have on the part of the person. So also one note here, it's particularly evident here when she's piling up all of these different words. She's sort of trying these different ways to describe what's happening. And this is a very, that kind of fragmentation and that kind of piling up of images is very typical of modernism. And this is such a good example. More used to scold than to flatter, to quarrel than to coo, to scramble than to ride, to struggle than to rest, to hate than to love. All of that sort of repetition of the structure, but with different words, is really pointing to the impossibility of expressing something easily. It's so masterful. I just am such a sucker for the things that she does, in fact, choose. Like this one, to quarrel than to coo, is just like, it's so good. She's just so good. I mean, I have at least one reader friend who thought that Orlando, the first time she read it, was a bit of a slog. And I can see, that like a lot of this kind of like accumulation of images, you might just be like, oh my God. But if you understand, in fact, that this is the biographer and Virginia Woolf and Orlando, all three of those writers, in fact, trying to get at some sort of truth with a medium that is very limited, which is language, then I think you have a little bit more patience for what, in fact, is going on. Okay, and then we're going to finish today by taking a look at the very end of the book. And so if you have not finished it and you want to go back and reread, I would turn this off at this point, and I promise I won't say anything earth-shattering after. We're just going to kind of read the end part because it is so masterful and so beautiful. So this is when, at the very end of the book, Orlando is really sort of shattered by the chiming of this clock. I mean, Orlando has lived at this point for almost 400 years. And as the reader, again, with my shitty memory, I couldn't remember how the book ended, but I was worried because I was like, oh my gosh, please don't let Orlando die. And in fact, Orlando does not die, which is great. So this is, the clock has been striking, and Orlando, we're moving towards something, but we don't know what it is. Here we go. All was still now. It was near midnight. The moon rose slowly over the weald. Its light raised a phantom castle upon earth. There stood the great house with all its windows robed in silver. Of wall or substance there was none. All was phantom, all was still. All was lit, as for the coming of a dead queen. Gazing below her, Orlando saw dark plumes tossing in the courtyard and torches flickering and shadows kneeling. A queen once more stepped from her chariot. "The house is at your service, ma'am," she cried, curtsying deeply. "Nothing has been changed. The dead lord, my father, shall lead you in." As she spoke, the first stroke of midnight sounded. The cold breeze of the present brushed her face with its little breath of fear. She looked anxiously into the sky. It was dark with clouds now. The wind roared in her ears. But in the roar of the wind, she heard the roar of an airplane coming nearer and nearer. "Here, shall hear," she cried, baring her breast to the moon, which now shone bright, so that her pearls glowed like the eggs of some vast moon spider. The airplane rushed out of the clouds and stood over her head. It hovered above her, her pearls burnt like a phosphorescent flare in the darkness. And as Shelmerdine, now grown a fine sea captain, hale, fresh-colored, and alert, leapt to the ground, there sprang up over his head a single wild bird. "It's the goose," Orlando cried, "the wild goose." And the 12th stroke of midnight sounded, the 12th stroke of midnight, Thursday, the 11th of October, 1928. I love it so much. I love this meta thing. I love the idea of ending here with the date on which she finished writing, but I also really, really love the romance in this. And I love the fact that it's not too on the nose. We're not ending with an embrace. What we're ending with here is, in fact, this goose who is taking flight above them, this wild bird, this sort of freedom, but also, of course, the idea of the wild goose chase. So you have this really beautiful idea here of Orlando, having come into this marriage with Shell, who is, it's unconventional, and it's really like a very sweet and kind of companionable relationship that allows both of them a lot of independence, which should be reminding you of, in fact, Leonard and Virginia's marriage. So if you are reading this as some sort of depiction and some sort of love letter to Vita Sackville-West, it's really significant that it ends with her having returned to her husband, or her husband having returned to Orlando, but Orlando really being so, so happy at the return of her husband. That would have been a very, very significant piece of the work. So I'm going to just leave it at that. I'm going to just admit that there's not a lot that I can add to this gorgeous, gorgeous prose and this incredible ending to this incredible book. So if you were listening to this as a way to sort of remember Orlando, then I hope that this has been satisfying. If you were reading it, before you dive back into the novel, then, I hope that it is really satisfying and that some of these ideas are helpful. So thank you so much for tuning in. And I was going to doff my hat, but I'm not going to because my hair actually would look so insane. So thank you very much for tuning in. And now that you're done with this, get back to the Fox page and find something else to listen to. Happy reading!